This is the third and final part of our tutorial called A Simple Editing Scenario that began on page 408 of chapter 13 in the textbook. And in this third part of the tutorial, we want to look at step 6, adding titles, transitions, and effects. This part of the tutorial begins on page 410 at the top of the page. So again, for this, I'm going to go over to Avid, and let's look at where we left off. And here's the timeline as it stood at the end of the second part of the tutorial. And what I want to do at this point is I want to add a title graphic to identify the person who is on the screen talking in this soundbite. This is standard editing protocol when you have someone on screen to go ahead and identify them with their name and their title. You see this in TV news packages all the time. You also see it in corporate video pieces and so forth. Most nonfiction types of programs and documentaries and so forth, you will see the subject on screen identified with what we call a lower third. And the term lower third comes from the rule of thirds, which we covered in the visual communications chapter, where if you remember that the screen was divided horizontally into thirds and vertically into thirds, and the horizontal line at the bottom of the page, the lower third, is where this term comes from. And typically graphics that are used to identify the subject on screen are placed in the lower third portion of the screen. So over here on the left hand side, I've loaded in a title graphic for this individual. Now this graphic was created in Photoshop, so a familiar program to you hopefully by this point in your progression through the book and through the course that you're in. Used Photoshop because it's just much more powerful. I can imagine and create and do all sorts of things in Photoshop that are really aesthetically pleasing, and it's just a powerful graphic design engine, much more so than I can usually do in the standard titling tool in most nonlinear editing programs. So for this particular project, I decided to use Photoshop to create the graphics. And Avid requires me to create the graphic over a transparent background, which I did, and then to export the graphic in a file format known as PNG, because it preserves the transparency of the background. It creates what's called in video lingo an alpha channel that's used by the Avid editor to replace the areas of the screen that don't contain any pixel data. So all of the transparent areas of the image here that to the computer are blank areas of the screen, it will superimpose the video in those areas behind the title that is going to be placed in the foreground. So I went ahead and prepped all this. This was done ahead of time, but I just wanted to let you know because most professional nonlinear editing programs will allow you to bring graphics that were created in Photoshop into the editing environment of that program. You just need to become familiar with the rules of that program. Some programs allow you to bring in the native PSD file. Avid actually allows me to do that. As well as JPEGs, and in this particular case Avid doesn't like JPEGs, it likes PNGs, so that's what I went ahead and created. So let me jump back over to Avid, and before I place the title in my timeline, I want to be mindful of a little bit of housekeeping again. I want to create a video track that for the most part throughout my timeline will be designated for lower thirds and titles. So to do that, I'm going to come over here to my timeline, right click once again, and choose new video track. And I now have video track 3. So we began with one track, we added the second track for B-roll, and now we have a third track that we will use for titles and for lower thirds. And if it's helpful to you, if you're familiar with Photoshop, in video editing programs you can think of tracks sort of like you would think of layers in Photoshop. The tracks are stacked upon one another, and the track that is on top will obscure the view of tracks that are beneath it. So if I have a fully opaque video image on track 3, it's going to obscure the view of the information beneath it. Now in this particular case, the only opaque area of my title graphic is the title itself. Everything else will be replaced, or it'll simply be like looking through a window. It'll be transparent pixels or the alpha channel that will allow me to see through to the video beneath it. But creating that third channel helps me again to manage the placement of my titles on screen and to keep my timeline from becoming cluttered and unmanageable, because as you can imagine, this is a very, very simple sequence we've created, and already I have 3 video tracks and I have 4 layers of audio information, or 4 tracks of audio information. So up here in my source monitor, I've set an endpoint, and I have purposely come in from what we would call the head of the clip. again, editing lingo, we typically refer to the beginning of a clip. Any clip that is loaded into the source monitor, it's a time-based element, so it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. All clips are defined by their time, by their length or duration. Well, the beginning of a clip is referred to as the head, the end of a clip is referred to as the tail. And one of the things you have to be mindful of is that when I place this clip in the timeline, I'm going to want to add a transition so that that title doesn't just cut in abruptly on screen, but that it transitions in over time. I like to use 20 frame dissolves. 20 frame dissolve is roughly 2/3 of a second to bring a lower third in and then to have it actually disappear from the screen. Well, if I'm going to do that, I have to have enough space at the head of my clip to accommodate that 20 frame transition. So as a general habit, I just want to come in and set my endpoint at least 1 second to 2 seconds in from the head of the tape. And that's what I've done here. I'll just reset it here so you can see. And there's my endpoint. I'm going to come down on my timeline, and I don't want to bring the title in right at the same point that the video comes in. I want to bring it in just a moment later, so I'll bring it in just a fraction of a second later. I'll mark an endpoint down here, and I'm going to make sure it goes out before this B-roll of the student dropping the egg in his parachute contraption from the top of the stadium wall here. So I'm going to make sure it goes out right before that transition to that next B-roll clip. I'll mark an out point, and I'm going to make sure that the video is copied to video track 3. So I'm targeting V3, and I'm going to turn off my audio tracks because there's no audio associated with this. It's simply a graphic. So the only edit that's going to take place is going to be a video edit when I perform this. This graphic will be placed in my timeline on video track 3 between the in and out point as I have it designated here. I'm going to choose overwrite and perform the edit and mark my playhead, and you can see the title has been superimposed over top of the underlying video. Now if I play through this, it's just going to cut in rather abruptly and cut out in the same manner.
I think it's a really neat program that reaches out and identifies children in our system that would be
and again, I apologize for the stuttering of the video. It's just unable to keep up while I'm doing the screen recording. So the last thing I want to do here is I want to add a transition to the beginning of this clip and one to the end. I'm going to use my quick transitions editor here, and I'm going to place a dissolve at the beginning of this clip, and I'm going to make it for 20 frames. And whenever you add transitions in your video editing program, it's a good idea to be able to think of length and duration in terms of frames. Remember, video is roughly 30 frames per second. So if you do a full 1 second transition, that's actually pretty long for the most part. Every time you add a transition, it potentially can increase the length of your program. So keeping your transitions from being excessively long is a good idea. In the beginning of a program where you want a really dramatic sort of fade in, you know, a 2 or 3 second dissolve might be appropriate. But for the most part, when you're just bringing titles in and titles out and transitioning from one shot to another, 2/3 of a second is plenty of time. So I tend to prefer a 20 frame transition rate when I'm editing most transitions into my timeline. And I've done that here. I just went ahead and put in 20 frames, which is roughly 2/3 of a second, and I'm going to add that to the beginning. And if I zoom in here, you'll see that an iconic representation of a transition has been added to that clip. Every program is going to be a little bit different. So if you're editing in Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere, how the timeline looks and how the on-screen graphics are used to show you a virtual representation of a transition. It's going to be a little bit different. But there's handles here, and there's tools that I can choose to extend and change this. I can open up the effects editor and actually manipulate the properties of this effect later, and every program will pretty much let you do that. I can select it and delete it as well. This editing environment is totally non-destructive, so just because I've added a transition doesn't mean it has to stay there. If I decide later I don't want it, I can select the transition and delete it. I'm going to go to the end and do the same thing. Place my playhead there and open up my quick effects editor, and this time we'll do it at the end of the cut. I'm still going to go with 20 frames. I'm going to keep everything nice and consistent. If you select 20 frames as a time frame, you want to be consistent all the way through the program and not change it from one edit to another. And so now if we play through this,
I think it's a really neat program that reaches out and identifies children in our system that would be success.
we see that the title now transitions in, and I'll just go through it slowly, one frame at a time, and you can actually see it fades in or dissolves in, and at the end it does the same thing, it fades out. And that makes for a much more gradual transition and softens the effect. Again, the idea of adding a dissolve to a title is to, again, make it a little less noticeable. It's going to ease in rather than jump in, and easing in is usually better. The viewer has an easier time processing information when it's not abruptly presented, but that it flows with the pace and the rhythm of the overall piece. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to do, I'll just show you again, you can apply transitions and effects also to transitions between clips. So if I wanted to, where this next shot comes in, where we go from the subject speaking to this shot of the student at the top of the stadium, I can also add a transition there, should I so choose to do so, and I can get creative with effects. I would just warn you not to go crazy with them. You can go overboard when adding effects to the video and the timeline. Be consistent. Cuts and dissolves, as the book tells you, are pretty much the bread and butter of a lot of video projects. But just to show you that you can do other types of things, I'm going to choose this one here, which is a horizontally centered squeeze, and I'm going to drag that onto the beginning of this next shot and just show you how you don't have to use dissolves and cuts should you so choose. But in this particular case, as I arrow through this, one frame at a time, we get a squeeze transition from left to right. Actually, it's from the center of the screen. And if I go the other way, I can go back. So transitions are used, again, as a way of easing the subject's eyes through the visual presentation of information on the screen. General rule of thumb, don't go overboard with them. Less is often more. And just be consistent. If you typically choose to use one type of wipe, then be consistent using that all the way through the program. Don't use 20 different wipes where every single transition and edit is a different effect. People are used to predictability. They like a sense of purposeful intentionality because it adds a positive element without becoming a disruptive element as you go through the program.